So, by late 1943, the war in the Pacific had certainly turned in favor of the Allies. We had been taking island by island with the ultimate goal of getting close enough to the Japanese home islands to be able to invade them or to bomb the heck out of them, which is what we ended up doing. But something needed to be done about Truk. The Japanese stronghold in the South Pacific, known as Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific, and the decision was made, rather than to invade it, to try to bomb it. And the code name for the attack is Operation Hailstone. And this Norwegian guy, Klaus Lindemann, wrote this book, and as you can see, it's called Hailstorm. Now, I don't know why he's got stones and storm. My guess is if you have enough stones, you've got a storm. So, before we get to the actual topic, some background is probably helpful. Kind of the start is just kind of where the heck is Truk. As you can see, it's about 3,500 miles south and west of Hawaii, 500 or 600 miles south of Guam, above New Guinea, and it's in what's called Micronesia and part of the Caroline Islands. It's not at the end of the earth, but they say that you can see the end of the earth from there. You're pretty close. So the islands, of course, have been home to native folks for thousands of years. The islands are volcanic. The highest peak is maybe 3,000 feet, give or take, maybe only a couple thousand, not real high. So I think in the 1500s, the Spanish showed up, and the Spanish claimed it as a Spanish colony. And we forget what a huge world power Spain was. Spain was the colonial rulers of most of South America, most of Central America, the Caribbean, a good portion of the United States, Los Angeles, San Francisco, the Straits of Juan de Fuca, up near Canada, San Antonio, St. Augustine. Spain ruled a huge part of the world, little old Spain. But into the 1800s, Spain's fortunes as a world power were definitely on the way down. Admiral Nelson had defeated the Spanish fleet off Trafalgar, hence the name for Trafalgar Square in London. Into the 1800s, they were continued to lose their properties. Give or take 1900, there's a revolution in Cuba going on. The Cubans are revolting against the Spanish rulers. The United States comes in, helps them kick the Spanish out. That's where Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders charge up San Juan Hill. What I've heard that Teddy was really quite splendid in his colonel's uniform that he had tailored at Brooks Brothers. He was from the right side of the tracks, so when you went into the military, you just started at a colonel. Colonel Roosevelt. He had never been in the military before, but he was a colonel. So part of the reason we got into Cuba was the battleship, the USS Maine, blew up in Havana Harbor. And the Hearst papers and the Pulitzer papers really just fanned the smolders of war. Remember the Maine. So we went in, helped the Cubans, and then once the Spanish were out, the treaty ending the Spanish-American, now it's called the Spanish-American War. The Cubans called it the Cuban War of Independence. The treaty ending that war was negotiated in Paris. It was negotiated between the United States and Spain. Cuba didn't have a seat at the negotiating table. We came in and took over as the colonial rulers of Cuba. About the same time, we sent the Navy over to Manila, sank the Spanish fleet, and I think that was, I can't remember which admiral did that. So that's how we got into the colonial business. That war, at the end of that war, we got Cuba, we got Guam, we got the Philippines, we got other colonies in the Caribbean. Of course, we don't call them colonies, we call them territories. About the same time that Spain is on the way down, Japan's on the way up. Around 1900, Japan annexed the formerly independent country called Okinawa, made it part of Japan. They invaded Korea. So lots going on about that time. Spain sells the Caroline Islands to the Germans. Germany had colonies down in that part of the world. There's a group of islands called the Bismarck Archipelago, named after the German ruler. So Japan's on the way up. They invade Korea. We are actually the first country to recognize Japan as the ruler of Korea. Korea asked for help from the United States. President Roosevelt said no. President Roosevelt received the Nobel Peace Prize around 1900 for negotiating the end of a war between Japan and Russia. Japan and Russia went to war over some islands, north of Japan and up towards Russia. He negotiated the end of that war, and as part of that became very impressed with the Japanese. The world was actually shocked that Japan could go to war with the great country of Russia, and they actually fought them pretty much to a standstill. So Japan now, like I said, is continuing as a colonial power. At the end of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles ending that war, one of the provisions was that Germany had to give up its colonies. And Japan stepped in and said, well, we'll take the Caroline Islands. So that's how Japan becomes the colonial ruler of the Caroline Islands around 1920. After they did that, they closed the islands to outsiders. So really, we don't know a lot about what went on there. So by the 1930s, Japan was continuing to expand. Japan did not have natural resources, so they invaded China and were making great progress in China. They were totally brutal to the Chinese people. It's just sickening how bad they were. Japan felt that they were a master race. They felt they were the superior Asian race, and they actually felt that they were superior to the Caucasians. Anglo-Saxons thought they were superior. The Japanese thought they were superior. Go figure. So by 1940, Japan had gone too far. They were threatening the British colonies in India, Hong Kong. They were threatening our colonies in the Philippines and Guam. They were threatening the Dutch colonies, and they were threatening the French colonies. French colonies then were what was called French Indochina. French Indochina we now know as Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, those countries. Of course, the Vietnamese had their first war of independence against the French in the early 1950s. So with this threat going on, Franklin Roosevelt met with Winston Churchill. And Churchill suggested that we impose economic sanctions against the Japanese to deter their aggression. Economic sanctions to deter a bad-acting country. Does that sound familiar? I mean, we're doing it now with Russia, we're doing it now with Iran, we're doing it with North Korea, and we're doing it with Cuba. This cuts off Japan's sources of steel and oil. The Japanese really can't get by without it, so there are negotiations in Washington, D.C. The Japanese don't understand why these Caucasians want to be the rulers of Asia. I mean, they're Asians, they want to rule Asia. Those discussions go nowhere. Discussions break off. The Japanese walk out of the talks, and guess what happens? They go bomb Pearl Harbor, start the war. They also, a few days after that, attacked the Philippines, where MacArthur is the military military governor. So after Pearl Harbor, we start back on this island hopping campaign to eventually get to the home islands. Interesting, we declare war against Japan. Franklin Roosevelt's speech, "Day will live in infamy," all that. Well, we've only declared war against Japan. We're not in the European war. For some reason, Hitler says, "Oh, if Japan's going to go to war with America, why don't we?" So he does. So then we went to war against Germany. Interesting question. If Hitler had not declared war against the United States, would we have just gone to war against Japan and not helped free Europe? We'll never know. But while we were attacked at Pearl Harbor and the Germans hadn't attacked us at that point, the decision was made 2/3 to 3/4 of our military forces, of our economic output, of our planes and ships we were gonna build and employ, went to Europe, not to Asia. We've viewed that Germany was a bigger worldwide problem than Japan was, and so we did less in the Pacific. And that's not to say we didn't do very much in the Pacific. We did an awful lot. So one of the first places we go back is an island called Guadalcanal. No one had ever heard of Guadalcanal. It's in the Solomon Islands. The reason it was picked was it was close enough to Australia that it was viewed as a potential jumping off point from which Japan could launch an invasion of Australia. The Japanese were building a very big airfield there, and it was marginally within the range of Australia. In fact, some of the northern parts of Australia, Darwin and up there, were bombed a number of times by the Japanese during World War II. So decisions made that we're going to do this island hopping campaign with the plan, of course, as like I said earlier, to get close enough to the home islands. Actually, that was not a foregone conclusion. Douglas MacArthur, being an Army guy, he favored a war plan that would give the Army a bigger part. Surprise, big surprise that there's a conflict between the military as to who's going to get to do what. So he actually favored going further east, up through India, but the forces were that the decision made was to go the other way. So that brings us to early 1944, when the decision is made that something needs to be done about Truk. So this is the aircraft carrier Yorktown. She's of the Essex class of carriers, the new fast carriers that were built post the start of World War II. She is a floating museum in Patriots Point, Charleston, South Carolina. If you're ever back there, it's really interesting. It's worth going to. So on the eve of the battle, this task force 58, has approached to within about 100 miles of Truk. So Truk Lagoon is the name of a lagoon. Truk Lagoon is in the state of Chuk, C-U-U-K. So sometimes you hear people refer to Chuk, sometimes you hear people refer to Truk. Chuk is a state in a country now called the Federated States of Micronesia. And there's Chuk, Korsai, Ponapai, and a couple other islands that and Yap. They're a federation of islands. So if you go to Yorktown, like I said, I really recommend it. You go down, one thing you get to go to is the kitchen. And one thing they have in the kitchen is a recipe. And it's like 260 eggs, 147 pounds of butter, X pounds of flour, and then this will tip it, 115 pounds of chocolate chips. When they made chocolate chip cookies, They made enough, so everybody got 2. So there was 3,000 sailors, give or take. Of course, back then it was all guys. Everybody got 2. Now, I haven't served on a carrier. I didn't serve at all. My guess is that if the admiral wanted a 3rd cookie, admiral got a 3rd cookie. So this task force that is assembled, it's the largest task force to date. In addition to the to Yorktown, there were 4 other of the new Essex class carriers. The Essex, Bunker Hill, Intrepid, and there was one other large carrier, the Enterprise. She was the only pre-World War II carrier as part of this task force. Each of the large carriers handled about 100 planes, and there were also 6 small, what they call jeep carriers, and they were about half the size. The big carriers were 25,000 tons. The jeep carriers were about 10,000. They could carry about 3 planes. Our carriers now are in the 80 to 100,000 ton size, so they're like 4 times bigger. They're not terribly longer. They're a lot wider. They're a lot deeper. They're a lot bigger. This battle group also included more than 6 battleships, 2 of the new Iowa-class battleships, the Iowa and the New Jersey, at least 10 cruisers, probably 20 destroyers, and a number of supply ships, a lot of tankers. The destroyers didn't have a very long range. They had to refuel relatively frequently. The carriers had like a 15,000 mile range, so they didn't need to refuel as often. So 5 o'clock in the morning, give or take, the carriers turn into the wind. They do that, and then they accelerate to maximum speed. These carriers could do almost 35 miles an hour. You could water ski behind these suckers. And they're doing that to turn into the wind so that the speed going forward with the wind creates additional lift to help the planes get off. They didn't have these fancy steam catapults. Now that'll basically shoot a rocket. So they were, to a large extent, just standing on the brakes, full power, and you've got enough to get off. So that is a Hellcat on the deck of, I think that's on Yorktown. The Hellcat was the first plane that we had that was a near match for the Japanese Zero. The Japanese Zero was introduced in about 1935. When it came on the scene in China, was where it was first flown in combat, it just shocked the world. No one thought that these Japanese people, nearsighted, this sub-race, could develop an airplane of this capability. Well, they did. The Zero is a fantastic airplane. It was made out of a particularly light aluminum alloy that made it light, very maneuverable, and it had a longer range. By the time this plane came out, it was a near match for the Zero. But this plane weighed almost twice what a Zero weighed. Another reason the Zero was so light, it did not have self-sealing gas tanks. There was no armor plating, and there was no bulletproof glass for the pilot. So our guys called them Zippos because they would light first time every time. And the Hellcat was superior in some ways to the Zero. It wasn't superior in all regards. The Zero, being lighter, could still turn faster, at least under certain circumstances. But by this point in the war, we knew how to fight the Zero. Starting with the Flying Tigers in China in the late 30s, early 40s, our guys were flying against the Zero and learned what it could do and what it couldn't do. And then we got a huge break in the Aleutian campaign, a Zero was forced down, and it wasn't destroyed. And we were able to recover it and to get it flying. And so we had a Zero to fly against our planes. And there literally are instruction books. If you're flying this airplane against a Zero, this is what you do. If you're flying this other airplane against a Zero, that's what you do. But the basic concept was the Zero was very maneuverable, particularly at low altitudes. The Zero did not do well in a dive. For some reason, in a high-speed dive, the controls on a Zero got heavy and it wasn't very maneuverable. They also learned that the Zero could turn better in a dive to the left. And a friend who's a retired fighter pilot, I talked to him about it. He said, well, there's a couple possibilities. One is the torque of the propeller wants to make the airplane go whatever direction the propeller is turning. The other explanation he gave me, it has something to do with the carburetor, in that if you're in a hard turn, that the gas doesn't get to the engine as well if the planes goes a particular direction. If there's anybody here who has any information on that, please let me know. So fighting a Zero, you get altitude, you dive on them, make what they call a gun run, and get out of there. So it's kind of like a opposite of NASCAR. Instead of go fast and turn left, it's go fast and turn right. So the first planes off are Hellcats, and their role is to establish air superiority over the target. It's still a rule today in any kind of air combat. You want to have air superiority so that the planes bombing aren't being harassed by fighters. So the Hellcats are first off about 5 o'clock in the morning. So as these guys are taking off, they don't know whether they're flying into a trap. They don't know if there's a surprise. They don't know a lot. They're about 100 miles out. They believe that the Japanese have radar. They don't know how good the radar is. They don't know how far out the Japanese will be able to pick them up. So obviously they're hoping for a surprise. The other thing they're hoping for is that there's going to be a bunch of really big Japanese ships at anchor in Truk Lagoon. It's about 20 miles by 20 miles, and it's a wonderful protected anchorage, and that's why it was chosen by the Japanese to be their base. A B-24 photo plane had flown over about 3 weeks before, and when it flew over, they saw in the lagoon 2 of the Japanese super battleships, the biggest battleships ever built, 2 aircraft carriers, a bunch of cruisers, a bunch of destroyers. And so the guys are really hoping that they'll be there, they'll get them. There's even talk that if we do well enough here, we'll be home for Christmas. So that's one of the dive bombers type that participated. There's one over there, go see it. There's also a Hellcat over there, and there's a big map that shows you a lot better where Truk is located. So the SBD dive bomber, they said slow but deadly. The plane was introduced in the mid-30s. By this time it was actually getting near the end of its use. It wasn't absolute, but we had a new dive bomber called the Hell Diver. But the guys liked this airplane. It was rugged as it can be. It was quite maneuverable. It actually was not a bad dogfighter. There was a forward-facing gun, and then there's a guy in the back with a gun, so that if they're being attacked from the rear, they at least have some protection. So, luck's on, at least partially luck's on our side. They have the element of surprise. Japan, the Japanese did have radar. The radar had a range of about 100 miles. So the Japanese did pick up the big bunch of airplanes coming their way. For some reason, the Japanese pilots lived on a different island than on which their airplanes were parked, at least a lot of them. There's several islands, and there's an island called Moan, an island called E10. And while the radar picked them up, by the time these guys got out of bed, got over to the island, got in their airplane, and take off, our guys are there. And like I had said earlier, ideal situation to fight a zero. You've got the advantage of altitude, they're down low. So our guys are coming in, I don't know, 5,000, 10,000 feet. The zeros are taking off. They can just come in, make the gun run on them. They're just getting off the ground. They're slow. They got nowhere to go. And our guys do really good. So shoot down roughly 80 Japanese planes. Another 100 plus are destroyed on the ground. We lose maybe 60 planes, which is 60-60. But overall, that's considered a real success. So we do establish the air superiority. Then in come the dive bombers and the torpedo planes. Unfortunately, there were not a lot of big Japanese ships left in Truk Lagoon. The Japanese had seen the photo plane coming over. They knew what was going on with the war and knew we were coming in the general direction. So they got the big guys out, took them up to Singapore and to other places. So in the battle, we sink 40-some Japanese ships, mainly cargo ships. We get a couple cruisers, some destroyers, a submarine. About 250,000 tons of shipping are sent to the bottom. 17,000 gallons of fuel are destroyed in tanks. Tons of provisions are destroyed. Not a lot of Japanese casualties. We weren't particularly interested in wiping out the troops. We wanted to neutralize it as a Navy and an air base. So that looks a bit like an aircraft carrier. It's not an aircraft carrier. It's an island. It was a coral reef, and the Japanese, with the help of 5,000 Korean slaves, turned that into an airfield. Basically, you've got a little coral, and you just keep adding wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow of stuff, and pretty soon you got yourself an airfield. So you can see a torpedo track going to, that's one of the ships located in the lagoon. So a number of our guys are shot down. And there's a Lieutenant Blair, and I don't have his first name, but Blair is a Hellcat driver. He's shot down. He gets out. I don't know whether he bails out or he ditches, but he's in the water just outside a Truk Lagoon. He's in his raft, and of course the Japanese see him go in, so the Japanese send out a patrol boat to pick him up. His buddies see him go in, and they're circling around there. So the patrol boat is going out to pick him up. His buddies come in, they strafe the patrol boat, and they drive him off. Happens 3 times. At that point, the Hellcats are low on fuel, and they have to head back. So while they're about 100 miles out, basically they took them, give or take an hour to get there, give or take an hour to get back. So they had about an hour's time that they could linger over the lagoon and do stuff. So just as the Hellcats have to go back, this plane shows up, and it's called a Kingfisher. And as you can see, it's a float plane. Kingfishers were carried on cruisers. They were launched off the back of a cruiser. And this is 1930s technology. Before radar, these were very valuable for searching, to find the enemy target. And then the other thing they could do is they could direct gunfire. When you're firing from a cruiser or a battleship, I think the battleship range was over 15 miles. So it's really pretty hard to see where the shells are coming down, so this was very, very helpful for that. Of course, by this time we had radar and they weren't as useful weren't needed for that. But they were used for search and rescue. So they send this Kingfisher out, and they get to Lieutenant Blair. That's actually Lieutenant Blair in the back seat. The guy on the wing is a crewman. There were two, the pilot and a crewman. But Kingfisher was a very reliable airplane. It's a good airplane, but it didn't have a lot of power. And so when you added another human being, let's just say Lieutenant Blair soaking wet, all his gear weighs 180 pounds, well, that's extra weight, makes it hard for the plane to get off. So what they did is they didn't give it a full tank of gas to save weight. So they get Blair, they get him back, and they get the plane on, and they always degas the plane, because if you get bullets come in and shells, you don't want gasoline in the plane. So anyway, there was a pint of gasoline left in the tank of the Kingfisher. So Lieutenant Blair was a lucky man. I haven't been able to determine whether Lieutenant Blair survived the war or not, but he was a lucky man then. So these Kingfishers, they could only pick up one guy max. So there's at least one instance where a Kingfisher went to rescue a crew of a bomber, and there was 5 or 6 guys. So they couldn't. We're all going to take off. So they basically just climbed on the pontoons and on the wings, and there's one instance where one of those suckers taxied 50 miles on the ocean to get the guys out. And what they did then was they usually would rendezvous with a submarine. Submarines did a lot of rescue of our pilots. In the building over there that's on the Pacific, there's an Avenger dive bomber. And it's what the first President Bush piloted. He was shot down near Iwo Jima. He was in the water. The Japanese came very close to getting him. A submarine came along and picked him up. So, I mean, how different would our history be if we didn't have, if the first President Bush hadn't survived? I mean, we wouldn't have had President Bush, but anyway, he was rescued, and I think they've actually got pictures of him in there when he was on the submarine. So, in the 2 days, they come back the next day and do more damage. Like I said, they sink 41 ships. The torpedoes were very effective against ships that are just sitting there. The dive bombers did okay, but there's one instance where there was a tanker, good-sized ship, 300 feet long. They dropped 14 bombs and none hit them. I mean, it's a small target, even though it's anchored. A lot of the stuff we see, like in the Midway movie, they're dive bombing an aircraft carrier. Well, an aircraft carrier is, an awful lot bigger target than a little cargo ship. And everything I've read in this book I showed you earlier by the Norwegian guy, don't have an explanation why so few of the ships were carrying, or the planes were carrying torpedoes. But in any event, it's considered a very successful raid. So there was just a couple large ships that were sunk. There were 2 cruisers that were sunk. One's called the Katori, and she was sunk by gunfire from the Iowa and New Jersey battleships. And this is the only instance where our battleships engaged other surface ships during the entire war. They were used very effectively for shore bombardment prior to invasion, but they just never were engaged with other ships. The day of the battleship had passed. Their guns had a range of, 15, 20 miles. The airplanes had a range of several hundred miles. And one of the Japanese strategies for the war was to have one ultimate battle. That was their plan. It was almost a religious thing for them. So they tried to lure us into a big gunfight. Well, we didn't want that gunfight. So we never engaged battleships. We did our damage, for the most part, with carrier planes, and our submarines also did a huge amount of damage. So part of the reason that the Katori was sunk by gunfire was the commander of Task Force 58 was a guy named Spruance. And he alternated command of the task force with Admiral Halsey. And Halsey was sick, and so they alternated commands. Well, Spruance is an old Navy guy. He grew up in cruisers and stuff like that. So I don't want to say he didn't like aircraft carriers, but when there was an opportunity for these battleships to go do something, by God, we're going to send the battleships and they're going to go do it. So he sent them out to sink the Katori and their destroyer escorts, and it was successful, but they probably could have sent carrier planes over and done it, but he wanted that, and he got it. So only one of our ships was hit. The aircraft carrier Intrepid took a torpedo near the stern, which damaged the rudder and the steering mechanism of the ship. I think 70 sailors were killed because of that torpedo. One torpedo doesn't come close to sinking an aircraft carrier. So she was able to escape, but because of the damage to the rudder, she, to a large extent, had to be towed to San Francisco to be repaired. The Intrepid had got a reputation as being kind of an unlucky ship. She also ran aground in the Suez Canal once, but she survived the war. Another thing I'd like to touch on is we don't realize how dangerous flying was in 1940. We take for granted that airplanes fly, they don't break down, they don't get lost. Well, in 1940, these planes were being mass produced. A lot of them weren't tested very much before they went into production. The pilots that were being trained quickly. Over 15,000 aircrew members died in training accidents in the United States. That's before they even got to where people were shooting at them. And there were large casualties, particularly in the Pacific. If you're in Europe, you're flying over any place, you have problems, you jump out, not that it's easy, you'll land on ground. And you might get captured, but you're going to land on ground. And if you get lost, you're over Europe. You get lost over the South Pacific. Go look at that map and see how big the South Pacific is. It is enormous. And a friend of mine was a carrier pilot in World War II, and he said, we lost a lot more planes to just stuff happening than being shot down by the Japanese. I mean, they had a compass. So you fly a couple of 100 miles out, going generally east to go look for something. You find it or you don't find it. And you fly back. Then you've got to find a speck in the ocean with a compass. There were no beacons to bring you in. Another friend of mine's dad was on a carrier in the South Pacific, and he said that if the planes got back after dark, they didn't turn the landing lights on. He said that you would hear them circling, looking for the carrier, and then you'd hear the engine quit. And if you go down in the middle of the ocean, I don't know what kind of radio beacons they had, if any, but the chances of getting picked up were not real good. So after the battle, we pretty much bypass Truk. We go on to other places, and things aren't good on Truk. These islands had a few thousand people, and before the Japanese came, and that was just kind of the natural number that the islands could support. The soil wasn't very fertile. You couldn't grow many things. You could grow coconuts. You could grow a root vegetable called taro, which I think is also poi, the Hawaiians. But there's not a lot, and of course they had fish. Well, You bring 30,000 hungry young men, put them on these islands, there's not enough to eat. After the war went on, the Japanese couldn't get cargo ships in. About once a month, a submarine would come in and bring them some tons of food. But it was a tough existence. So of course, the war ends in August 1945. The Japanese troops on Truk don't get home until December 1946. So there were millions of Japanese soldiers and sailors stationed on islands all over the South Pacific, China, and how do you get them home? You know, we'd sank a good portion of the Japanese merchant fleet. So I know we helped them bring them home, but, you know, rightly so, we had a higher priority getting our guys home than getting Japanese guys home. But they eventually got home. So B-29 crews and B-24 crews, when they first got to Saipan and Guam, would fly practice bombing raids to come over to Truk. So these are the two Japanese officers. One guy's an admiral, and the other guy's the Army guy who signed the surrender papers in August, September 1945. When the admiral was asked, why were things so tough? He said, ask your submarine commanders, because they'd sank all the ships. On why he couldn't remember dates, he said, why bother? There are no seasons. It's hot every day. Flowers bloom every day. It rains every day. There's not enough to eat every day. We are bombed every day. Because food was scarce, he grew potatoes for his staff. He says, I have what I call a South Seas Doctor of Potato degree. For disciplinary purposes, I should strut around and give orders, but one cannot act like a glorious admiral when I'm walking around in a loincloth with a potato hook digging potatoes. So after the war, there were war crimes trials in Guam. We hear a lot about the Nuremberg war crime trials where the Germans were justly tried for their atrocities. Well, the Japanese were tried for their atrocities mainly in Guam. They actually flew some natives in from Truk to testify. The Japanese were incredibly brutal to pretty much everyone they dealt with. And while the Germans, for the most part, have acknowledged their sins in World War II, the Japanese have been very, very reluctant to do so. So not much goes on after World War II. But in the 1960s, the islands are discovered for scuba diving. And some say the French guy, Jacques Cousteau, is the one who came. Other things I've read say a guy named Al Giddings came. Giddings took a lot of photographs which were in National Geographic magazine. It's one of the highest selling issues of the National Geographic to date. And this is the first a lot of people saw the beauty underwater and the color that was there. So, trivia question. Anybody heard of Emile Gagnon? No, you haven't. I hadn't either. Emile Gagnon, along with Jacques Cousteau, invented the scuba regulator. Cousteau was a French Navy guy in World War II. He was doing some diving, the hard hat diving. Emile was a mechanical engineer, so they developed the first regulator. Briefly the way it works, you got the tank on your back and it's full of air at high pressure, like 3,000 pounds per square inch. Well, you just can't breathe out of 3,000 pounds, you know, just blow you up. So the almost all regulators now are two-stage regulator. The stage back here, called the first stage, lowers the air pressure from the 3,000 down to about 750, and comes at that pressure up to your mouthpiece. And the second stage of the regulator lowers the pressure to an amount that you can breathe. The reason it's difficult is that as you go down, the water pressure on the outside is pushing against it. So you need to have something that adjusts for that water pressure. And basically the way they do it is they take the water pressure and they route it around kind of the back to boost it. Because what you want is that when you suck, that you pull just hard enough to overcome a spring that keeps that valve closed and allows you to get air in. And then when you stop, you want it to stop because you don't want the air to keep flowing out. If the air keeps flowing out, your tank empties in a few minutes. Regulators are designed so that if there's a problem with them, the air comes out too easy. It's called in the regulator free flow. Because, I mean, it's one thing to have your air coming out a little fast and it's going to go away in a couple of minutes. Another to pull on it and to get nothing. So, and the regulators are very safe. Almost all diving accidents are because human error. And I've made some errors, but not that one. So this guy, his name is Kimono Isiki. He learned to dive in the 60s. A couple stories on how he learned to dive, but I guess it doesn't matter. He was 17 when the Japanese attacked. And so when Giddings and Cousteau get there, they find this guy, and he tells them where the wrecks are. He finds a good number of the wrecks. The guy who wrote the book finds more wrecks in the 80s and 90s. And he opens the first dive shop in Truk. And it becomes, I mean, it's the best wreck diving in the world because it's shallow and there's lots of rusty metal on the bottom. So this is a plaque on one of the ships in memory of this guy. His daughter now runs we were there in 2010. His daughter ran the dive shop then. So if you visit there, basically for us, we flew to Hawaii, to Guam, and then it's kind of a milk run through some of these small islands down there. But it's a 737. So you're going to stay on land in this motel, which is maybe 2.5 stars. I mean, it's fine, but it's not a fancy resort. Or you can stay on a liveaboard dive boat. This is the Odyssey. This is where my wife Kathy and I stayed. She's about 100 feet long. I think there's maybe 10 cabins. They're small, but you have your own head and your own shower. And the accommodations are really quite good. So life on a dive boat starts at 7 in the morning, breakfast, and during breakfast they give you a dive briefing. And so as you can see, this is one of the ships, and the boat is moored over the wreck, and you're told what's where. If you want to go see a torpedo, go look in the front door. If you want to look at a jeep, go look in the back door. So there's three. They say there's 3 rules on a dive boat. You got to go to the dive briefing. Once you've had your first drink, you've had your last dive for the day. And then the third rule is you have to promise to come back to the boat alive. So a lot of diving now is done breathing what's called nitrox. The air we breathe is roughly 79% nitrogen, roughly 21% oxygen. It's the nitrogen in the air we breathe that gives you problems diving. The bends and nitrogen narcosis are caused by the nitrogen in the air that we breathe. I think it's called Boyle's Law, but nitrogen under pressure permeates the tissue, and if you get too much in you and you come up too fast, it tries to come out of the tissue, it forms bubbles, and those bubbles can give you the bends, which can be very painful in the joints. It can also block arteries in the brain, cause a stroke. So you don't want to get bent. So this is me testing my tank. You test to see what your your percentage is. A lot of the time, we ran 32% oxygen. So with 32% oxygen and then 68% nitrogen, you're breathing less nitrogen. So you can stay down longer without having to worry about decompression. It's about a 20% increase. But there's a downside of breathing too much oxygen. Oxygen under pressure at depth is toxic. So you can only breathe pure oxygen down to, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 feet. And there's a table. 32% mixed is good to a little over 100, feet. As we want to deeper dives, we do a different mix. I've never done it, but the high-tech divers do a trimix. They replace the nitrogen with helium. And then the helium is also an inert gas. It does not have the problems that nitrogen does. And with helium, then you can leave your oxygen percentage at a safe level without having to boost the nitrogen back up. You don't want to get the bends at Truk because that's their decompression chamber. Actually, that's not really their decompression chamber. That's the old decompression, but I like to show the slide because it always gets people's attention. The new decompression chamber looked wonderful. They told us it's a great decompression chamber, but no one here knows how to work it. So after the dive briefing, announcements given, the pool's open. Most of the diving here, we were on our own. There were guides that if you wanted to have a guide, they'd take a guide. They would have a couple safety divers in the water, but basically the attitude was, if you come this far, you're probably a pretty experienced diver. There's not a lot of current. The visibility is real good. So do your dive, and if you need help, we'll be there, but we're not going to lead you around like you're in kindergarten. So this is a guy we met. He's from Bremerton. Interesting guy. As you can see, he always went in first. He didn't like to dive with buddies. He wanted to do his thing. So he's got twin cylinders on the back. Those are big twin cylinders. I was diving with 100 cubic foot. Those look like those are at least 200s. I mean, twin 100s, maybe twin 110s. He's got the second bottle on the side, which is called a sling bottle, and that's probably about half the size. I'm going to say that's about a 40 cubic foot thing. He's got an entirely redundant system on his second bottle, so that if there's a problem with the first with the main rig, he can go to a second bottle. Actually, a third bottle. The two bottles in the back are hooked together, so those are tandem. And I think what he was doing, since he could stay down so long, even breathing nitrox, he was going into decompression. So basically, if you're down too long, you have to make stops on the way up. The diving now is with a computer. Back in the day, you had a chart that said, oh, if I go down to 110 feet, I can go 22 minutes, and you just kept track of it. Now with a computer, you don't have to do that, although, of course, computers never fail. So it's a good idea to know generally, yeah, I'm going to go to 110 feet, and I probably shouldn't stay down more than this, but this keeps track of it for you. The other thing it does that's wonderful is the dive tables, they don't know how long you're going to take to go down. They don't know if you're going to go up and down. So the assumption is that if you're going to 110 feet, you're spending your entire dive at 110 feet, and the table is based upon that. The computer takes your pressure reading several times a minute, takes into account how much you're going up and down, and then gives you that information. And basically what it shows, in addition to how much air you've got left, it shows how many minutes you have before you go into decompression. It tells you how many minutes you have of air at your current depth. And then if you go into decompression, it will tell you, okay, you need to stay at 60 feet for 4 minutes, and then it counts down. While we didn't go into decompression, most diving now you do a safety stop at 15 feet. And the Odyssey was really nice. It had a bar, 2 chains with a bar, and it's at 15 feet. So you just go up to the end of your dive, you go up to the bar, put your arm on, let air out, go negative. You just hang there for 3 minutes, and then you surface. If you're diving in an open water, then you need to have your skills such that you can hover at 15 minutes, 15 feet for your 3 minutes, and then go up. This guy was a wreck nut. I asked him if he'd been other places, and he said, nope, you seen one fish, seen them all. But he sure liked rusty metal. So I think his second bottle probably was 40% oxygen, give or take. So if he'd go down for his decompression stop, when he'd come back up, if he's breathing 40% oxygen, he doesn't have to stay. His decompression stop is shorter. But remember, if he's at 60 feet on that decompression stop, he can't be running 40% oxygen. So that allows him to run a higher oxygen percentage and to have a shorter stop. So you hit the water, and the ships, I mean, they're just, even though the visibility is good, they're just kind of ghostly. They just kind of come at you. So this is my wife, Kathy, the dive goddess, the world's best dive buddy. She follows me around to all these places and says that she likes to go. So those are the propellers on a Japanese ship called the Hailstone. She was a luxury liner before World War II, and she came to Seattle in 1934, and it was a big deal. She had set the speed record for crossing the Pacific. 15,000 people stood in the line in the rain in Seattle to go on the Hailstone. The largest ship there that was sunk, she's about 11,000 tons. This is some soft coral. That's a lionfish. Lionfish are indigenous to this part of the world. They're beautiful fish. They call them lionfish because the things that come out look kind of like lion's mane. They're poisonous. Those spines, they won't kill you, but I'm told that they'll make you wish you were dead. And they've gotten into the Caribbean, and there are a huge problem. They have no natural enemies, so they're destroying the reef fish in the Caribbean. We've been in dives in the Caribbean. We'll see 20 of those. They're starting to cull them, to shoot them. They're actually quite tasty. The only thing I've ever shot and ate is a lionfish. We were on a dive someplace, and they let us shoot them. They're stupid, and so you have like a slingshot, and you just basically go. You can get like a foot from them, and since they aren't afraid, you just get about a foot from them, and you let your sling go, and you know. The resort we were staying at, they cleaned them and cooked us for them. They were wonderful. So there's Kathy again. What a camera hog. So that's me. That's a deck gun on one of the ships. So this is a plate on a gun, and the 1899 is the year of manufacture. So it's believed that this gun was taken off an older Japanese ship, probably one that fought in the war with Russia around 1900, and they had just taken it and put it on one of these cargo ships. That's a thing that tells the boat how fast to go. You can see a lot from the outside, and then a fair number of the ships have good size openings. I think that's a torpedo hole. Those are battleship shells. For years, they were said that they were for the Japanese super battleships, which had the largest gun ever mounted on a naval ship, roughly 17 inches, although they calculate in centimeters. Our Iowa-class battleships had 16 inch. So all the dive magazines said that, and they're just laying there like Tinker Toys. All the dive magazines said that these were from the Japanese super battleship. Well, then someone took a tape measure down and measured the suckers, and they aren't. They're big. They're 15-inch shells. So they're probably for an older class of Japanese battleship called the Nagano class, which had 15-inch guns rather than the really big ones. So while you can see a lot on the outside, sometimes you have to go in. I think that's me, although that could be Kathy. We both have yellow fins. So you can see we've got the one cylinder, which is either 100 or an 80 cubic foot. The small yellow bottle is sometimes called a bailout bottle or a pony bottle. And the ones we had were about 12 or 16 cubic feet, and that's an entirely redundant system. So I've got a separate regulator on that, so that if you have a problem, even though problems are rare, you've got your secondary bottle to go to. You don't use that to stay down longer. That's for emergency purposes. Didn't use it on the trip, except the very last dive. When I was at the safety stop, I decided, well, I might as well empty it, because I'm going to have to empty it and get on the airplane. You can take those on an airplane, but you can't have them pressurized. So you have basically a cork you stick in it so that the airline people can look inside it. But as a combination, they don't want you to be smuggling stuff inside it, and then they don't want a pressurized bottle in the hold, because it rarely happens, but if the top blows off, that valve is it's a bullet that's propelled by 3,000-pound air. That's neither of us. That must be a friend from Bremerton, because he was the only guy diving the Twins. So they claim that this is a surgeon's table in one of the ships. They claim those are human bones. I don't think they are. I think they just put them there for tourists. There were lots of human remains on the ships for a long time. And in the 1980s, the Japanese government and the veterans group sent a group there to remove the human remains that were accessible. And they had a big funeral pyre. They burned them. They laid wreaths on the ships. And I mean, the Japanese were rightfully upset that tourists are coming and bringing home a portion of their loved ones. I mean, these are graves. I mean, the Japanese were evil in the war, but the remains of their veterans don't need to be sitting on my mantle. So as you can see, this is one of the ships, and this plaque was put there in '94. I think that's when they came and did their remains. So that's a Japanese Zero. That's an engine room. Another engine room. That's a cylinder head from a steam engine. The Japanese ships, for the most part, they're steam powered, and for the most part, they're coal. So, like I said, for the most part, we're on our own. Well, but they said that we will take you any place you want to go. So, at one point, I went to one of the dive leaders, and I asked her, I said, I want to go see the engine room in I forget what ship it was, and because I wanted to get this picture. This picture's in all the dive magazines, and it's called R2-D2. But it's an air compressor. And so she said, okay, we'll go, follow me. And I'm not trained as a penetration wreck diver, probably never will. The basic technique is you have a line, and you attach the line someplace outside, and then you've got a reel, so you follow it in and follow it out. But that's easier said than done. And if you get into a confined space in a wreck, and you're not careful, you can stir up silt. And if you stir up silt, you'll be blind, and it's not good. So anyway, she said, follow me. She said, we'll go in, we'll go down a stairway, we'll take a right, we'll be in the engine room. R2-D2 is in the machine shop that's off the engine room. It's behind what looks like a cyclone fence. There's a door. We'll get there. I'll point to the door. You can go in, get your picture. So we go in, we go down a flight of stairs. Well, the problem is the flight of stairs is not like that, it's like that. And then you go down, and so anyway, we get in the engine room, and she points to the cyclone fence. And so I go into this machine shop, and it's not very big. And so I get my picture of R2-D2, and then I get the hell out of there. I'm not terribly claustrophobic, but I'm glad I was with her. So that's what you think it is. And as they say, this guy is no longer at the service of the emperor. The bomb blast fused his skull into steel. And I believe that when they took the human remains out in the 90s, that they took the rest of the skeleton. That before then, I mean, the skeleton was hanging there. So a few of the ships have interesting stories. This is a submarine, the I-169. She and her sister ship, the I-170, were part of the attack on Pearl Harbor. So she's on the surface when the attack comes, and like any self-respecting submariners, when there's a bombing that goes on, you decide we're going to sit this one out on the bottom. So they submerged. Unfortunately, they left open what's called the induction valve. World War II submarines were diesel electric. They had a diesel engine on the surface which charged batteries, and then when they were submerged and they didn't have air for the diesel engines, they could run on batteries, but the batteries didn't last very long. So when you're on the surface, you've got the induction valve open because you're bringing air into the submarine. Well, when you submerge, you need to close the induction valve. Well, they didn't close the induction valve, so she went down like a stone. So, like the next day, a couple days later, the dust is kind of settled, and someone says, well, what happened to the 169? I said, well, I think she's submerged. So they knew where she was. They went out there, and they sent down a hard hat diver, and she's sitting on the bottom in 130 feet of water, brand new. They go with a hammer and they knock on the side, and somebody knocks back. So basically, these guys are still alive in there. So they bring a barge out, big cables, put the cables down, loop them onto the submarine, and they try to lift it. The cables break, goes back down to the bottom. They send the divers down again the next day, no answer. So those guys suffocated in there. So the Japanese thought we were, and they didn't want the code book and other stuff in the submarine to be used by us. So they dropped their own depth charges on their submarine in there. And as you can see, the depth charges blew the back of the submarine off, but the rest of it's pretty intact. It sits in 140 feet of water. And you see in big letters, no penetration. Do not go in. So the engine room hatch is open. So I stuck my head in there just to look around. I've ever been on this, I didn't serve, but I've been on submarines, and there's not a lot of room inside submarines. And when they get sunk, all kinds of bad stuff happens. The pipes are down, the wires are down, so you didn't want to go in there. But a couple divers did go in the 1980s. A couple guys died in there. Oh. Help! What'd they do? Oh, fine. Thank you. That's a periscope. So, this is a ship called the Hoikui Maru. She was built in Scotland and launched as the Hiroki. She was captured by the Japanese, and the New Zealand sailors on her didn't want to help the Japanese. So they threw overboard spare parts and the instruction manuals. She was diesel-powered, had a reciprocating engine. The Japanese didn't really know how to run it. So they didn't want to help the Japanese. So they threw that stuff overboard. That did not make the Japanese very happy. So these guys got sent to a prisoner of war camp in Japan, and half of them died in captivity. The other half were awarded the Victoria Cross, which is the second highest medal that the British government gives. You did not want to be a prisoner of war of the Japanese. About 40% of the POWs in Japan died. The Japanese did not follow the Geneva Convention at all. They starved people, they worked them, they beat them, they tortured them. Terrible, 40%. Vietnam was terrible, but only about 15% of POWs in Vietnam, we believe, died in captivity. Of course, we don't know for sure, but it's about 38% of our prisoners of war in Korea died. The North Koreans were almost as bad as the Japanese. If you were a prisoner of war of the Germans in World War II, you had about a 5% mortality rate. I don't want to lessen what the POWs in Germany went through, but the Germans, for the most part, followed the Geneva Convention. The prisoner of war camps were run by the Luftwaffe, not the Gestapo. It was terrible, but your chances of coming back alive were pretty darn good. So the last dive is on the San Francisco Maru. She's a 385-foot freighter, but she's deep. She's in 200 feet of water. The night before the dive, I went to the skipper and I said, Kathy and I have about 100 dives, so we're not super experienced. I said, are we up to this? And he goes, yeah, we've been watching you all week. And what they do, of course, is at the end of the week, they watch people, and if you look like you can't handle it, they're going to politely tell you to stay on the surface. But we got to go. And on this one, very controlled dive. 4 divers with a crew member. You ascend and descend on a line. And he had an extra bottle. That's one of the leaders. But it's a great wreck. The deck's 165 feet, partly because of the depth is very well preserved. That's a Japanese Type 3 tank. It's a little bigger than a Volkswagen Bug, 3-person crew. The armor on them was so thin that a shell from our Shermans would go in one side and out the other. So, trip ended. For an armchair historian and diver, it was a trip of a lifetime. We were there a week, 22 dives on 10 ships, a trip of a lifetime. Basically, you dive at 8 o'clock, 11:30, 2 o'clock, and 4:30. So you're tired at the end of the day. You could do a dive after dinner, but like I said, if you had a drink at dinner, you didn't have another dive. So 4 dives a day was plenty. I was tired. So it was a great trip. We did it in 2010. The wrecks continued to deteriorate with rust. But if you're a diver and you're thinking about it, I highly recommend it. So that's what I have. I can take a few questions.